I'm a veteran cop, and this case still haunts me to this day. It was a normal night when the phone rang, echoing through the stifling quiet of the Northfield police station, a small town tucked away in the mountains of Vermont. I, Thomas Reed, was nearly done with my shift. The clock on the desk read 10:45 p.m., and the light rain outside made the atmosphere heavier than usual. I answered without much haste, expecting something trivial, maybe a drunk causing a disturbance or a domestic dispute. But the voice on the other end shattered that feeling of routine. "Officer Reed, we need help. It's about my daughter, Emily. She's gone." The woman's voice was shaky, breathless, as if the words were taking all the air from her lungs. "Calm down, ma'am. Let's take it slow. What's your name?" I asked, already grabbing my notepad. "Watson. Karen Watson. My daughter, she hasn't come home. It's been hours." The woman sounded on the brink of despair, each word heavy with fear. I quickly jotted down the name and address. Emily Watson, the Watsons' daughter, was known around town, like most people were. A typical teenager, always quiet, never drawing much attention. I stood up, feeling a faint knot of worry begin to form in my gut. After hanging up, I called my partner, John, who was playing solitaire in the corner of the room. "We've got a missing person. Let's move before the rain gets worse." We left quickly. The drive to the Watsons' house was short, but each minute felt heavier with the weather and the nighttime silence. Northfield wasn't known for serious problems. Missing persons? That just didn't happen here. We arrived at the house, a simple two-story structure surrounded by a low fence. Karen Watson was on the porch, pacing anxiously. Her red, swollen eyes betrayed that she'd been crying for a while. "Come in, please. You have to find my daughter," she said, her voice thin and trembling as she opened the door for us. Sitting on the couch, her husband, a large man with a worn-out face, was rubbing his hands over his face in complete silence. "Mr. Watson, Mrs. Watson," I began, speaking calmly. "We need to know exactly when and where you last saw Emily." Karen took a deep breath, trying to pull herself together. "She left the house around 4 in the afternoon, said she was going for a walk. She never takes this long. She should have been back before dark. I looked everywhere she usually goes, and nothing." I paused, reflecting. A teenager going for a walk and not returning by nightfall in a small town like this? It didn't add up, especially for someone like Emily. John looked at me, and we exchanged a glance of understanding. We had work ahead. I grabbed the radio and called the station to begin organizing a search, focusing on the woods surrounding the town, a place where many local kids like to wander. The next morning, the sky was overcast, with the same heavy air that had been smothering the town since the night before. John and I returned to the Watsons' house to start our field investigation. Something was off in the air, a feeling I couldn't name, but it already bothered me. "Reed, where do you think she could be?" John asked as we got into the car. He was trying to sound casual, but I knew he was just as worried as I was. "If she was last seen near the forest, that's where we'll start," I responded, trying to ignore the growing anxiety. The forest around Northfield always had a curious presence. It wasn't uncommon to hear stories of kids getting lost there for a few hours, though they were always found, usually confused and unable to explain what had happened. We parked near the entrance to the main trail. I'd been here countless times, but this time, something felt different. The silence in the forest was oppressive, almost unnatural. There were no birds, no wind, not even the rustling of leaves. "It's too quiet," John commented, glancing around. I nodded, feeling the same unease. We grabbed our flashlights, even though it was daytime, and started walking down the trail in the direction Emily had last been seen. About 15 minutes later, we reached a clearing I'd never noticed before. It was strange, almost as if the air there was heavier, laden with an energy that made me feel like we were being watched. In the center of the clearing were stones, 6 of them arranged in a perfect circle. Each one was large, irregular in shape, but what really bothered me was the symmetry. They seemed deliberate, placed there for some reason. "What the hell is this?" John asked, approaching cautiously. I moved closer too, examining the stones. They were old, covered in moss, but there was no doubt they'd been there a long time. The discomfort I felt grew. My stomach turned, as if something inside me knew this wasn't supposed to be here. Let's head back and report this. Organize a more detailed search, I said, trying to ignore the feeling that something was watching us from the forest's shadows. John nodded, but he didn't look convinced. As we walked back, the silence of the forest seemed to follow our every step, as if waiting for the right moment to break. The morning was still cold when we returned to the woods. The search team was already organized, about 8 men, all familiar faces used to the forests surrounding the town. Men who, like me, had dealt with Northfield's peculiarities. Hunts that stretched into the early morning, searches for people temporarily lost. But this was different. There was a palpable tension between us, even though no one spoke openly about what we really felt. Maybe it was the clearing, or maybe it was just the idea of a missing girl, but something about this place affected me in a unique way. And from what I saw on the others' faces, they felt the same. John and I led the search. With flashlights ready and radios synced, we split into pairs. We would cover different parts of the forest, trying to cover as much ground as possible. The clearing, of course, would be the focus of our attention, and it was my job to closely follow any clues that might lead us to Emily. But as we ventured deeper into the woods, that strange feeling from the previous day only grew. It was only after a few minutes that I realized what was really bothering me. The silence. A deep, absolute silence. There were no sounds of birds, insects, or even the rustle of leaves in the slight breeze. Nothing. The forest, which had always been alive with the subtle sounds of nature, now seemed dead. "Hey, are you hearing this?" John suddenly asked, turning to me, his eyes narrowed in discomfort. "Hearing what?" I asked, still focused on the surroundings. "Exactly. I'm not hearing anything." He wiped his forehead, as if trying to shake off the oppressive feeling. The quiet was so thick it seemed to hang in the air like a cloud, smothering any attempt at communication. I found myself frowning, straining to catch any sound, but it was as if nature itself was holding its breath. This heightened the discomfort among us. I saw the same unease in the faces of the other men when we crossed paths or communicated briefly over the radios between the trees. We continued toward the clearing, each step more cautious than the last. I knew the absence of natural sounds meant something was wrong, very wrong. My grandfather, who hunted in these woods decades ago, used to say that when the animals went silent, it meant something else was lurking, something they feared. The memory of his old stories sent a chill down my spine. "All clear here. Read." Carl's voice crackled over the radio, but his tone, though neutral, seemed forced. We were all trying hard to keep our composure. "Keep moving forward. Have you found anything?" I asked, the radio static filling the void around us. "Nothing. Not a trace. It's like the girl vanished into thin air." Carl paused before adding, "But yeah, it's strange, Reed. I don't like this." None of us liked it. The clearing wasn't far now, and I knew that once we got there, we'd have to confront the discomfort those stones caused. 6 stones, forming an almost perfect circle, as if someone or something had meticulously placed each one. I couldn't pinpoint what exactly scared me about them, but the thought that they might have some darker meaning wouldn't leave my mind. The radio crackled again, this time with the voice of another pair of officers patrolling the opposite side of the trail. "Reed, we found something about 300 meters to the north. A piece of cloth. Looks like it's from a woman's clothing." My heart raced. Finally, a lead. This could be what we were looking for, something that would lead us to Emily. I looked at John, and he nodded, indicating we were on the right track. We hurried toward the described location, weaving through denser trees and low branches until we reached a small patch of dirt. There, hanging from a low branch of a twisted tree, was a piece of fabric. Faded blue, torn at the edges. I recognized it immediately. It was the same color as the jacket Karen Watson had described the night before. "It's hers?" I murmured, picking up the fabric and examining it. It was damp from the previous night's rain, but it didn't seem like it had been left there for long. "But where is she?" John spoke aloud, almost as if asking the forest itself. Before I could respond, something strange happened. The radio on my belt crackled with a loud, irregular static, cutting through the silence. I tried adjusting the frequency, thinking it was interference, but the static only grew louder, as if something was trying to disrupt our communication. "Reed, are you getting this?" Carl's voice was muffled by the static, and I could barely understand him. "Yes, but the signal's bad," I replied, trying to suppress the growing sense of unease. John looked at me, his eyes wide. The forest around us seemed darker, as if the shadows had stretched, covering the ground with an unnatural darkness for that time of day. And then, that silence, that damn oppressive silence came back, even thicker than before. It was as if the forest was suffocating us, watching every move. "I think we should head back," John suggested, the nervousness clear in his voice. I was about to agree, but something stopped me. An instinct, a quiet voice inside me, told me it wasn't time to leave just yet. There was more to this forest, something we hadn't uncovered, something that didn't want to be found. But still, I started to retreat. John was beside me, and the piece of cloth was clenched in my hand, a reminder that Emily was still out there, somewhere. As we walked back, the forest seemed to close in around us, each shadow growing denser, each non-existent sound more suffocating. The feeling of being watched grew with every step, and I knew that something was waiting for us, deep in that silent wood. Something we hadn't yet understood, but was about to reveal itself. The return to the station that afternoon was heavy. The forest, with its suffocating silence and the strange feeling that surrounded us, weighed on my mind. The piece of cloth we found was the only solid clue, but even that felt insufficient. Emily was still missing, and though we had covered a good part of the forest, all we found was a trail that disappeared into the middle of that void. More and more, I felt that something was wrong. Something beyond just the disappearance itself was taking root inside me. Walking into the station, the familiar smell of stale coffee and old paper brought me some brief relief, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were groping in the dark. John went straight to the kitchen for a cup of coffee, while I sat at my desk, reflecting on our next steps. We needed more leads, something beyond a strange clearing and a torn piece of clothing. That's when an idea hit me. Northfield was an old town, with a long history of unusual events and local legends passed down from generation to generation. Though I wasn't the kind of guy who paid attention to superstitions, this case was pushing the limits of my skepticism. What if there was something more buried in the past of that forest? Something that could explain what was happening? I decided to dig through the old files at the station. Northfield always had its share of records, many of which had never been digitized. In the back of the station, there was a small steel file cabinet, locked and almost forgotten, containing dusty folders that no one had looked at in years. That seemed like the right place to start. The key to the file was hanging in the records cabinet, and as I took it, I felt a slight chill. It was as if I was about to stir up something that should have been left forgotten. The cabinet creaked as I opened it, and the smell of old paper filled the room. The folders were organized by date, and I started flipping through the records from the 1930s, a time that, as far as I knew, hadn't brought many notable cases. However, as I went through them, a yellowed folder caught my attention. It was labeled with a tag that seemed almost faded by time. Disappearances? 1932 to 1935. My stomach turned as I opened the folder. Inside were newspaper clippings, notes, and handwritten reports from former sheriffs, scribbled in sloppy handwriting. The first few pages described 2 missing person cases that felt eerily familiar. The first dated back to July 1932. A 16-year-old boy, William Harper, had disappeared after last being seen near the Northfield forest. The report said he went hunting with friends but separated from the group early in the evening and was never seen again. The body was never recovered. The search lasted weeks, and authorities at the time concluded that he might have gotten lost and died due to harsh conditions. The second disappearance, in August 1934, involved a young woman named Mary Fields, 17 years old. Like Emily, she had gone for a walk near the forest and never returned. The only clue found was a bloody handkerchief, hanging from a branch near a trail. The search stretched for months, but again with no success. No body, no explanation. The similarities between these cases and Emily's were disturbing. The pattern of young people disappearing near the forest without a trace made me question what else might be hidden within the pages of those files. I continued flipping through the pages until I found a note from September 1935 that made me hold my breath for a second. The sheriff at the time, Harold Atkins, had left a short, cryptic note at the end of one of the reports. 3 young people missing in 3 years. The same forest. The same feeling that something is wrong. Some say the Guardian is back, but there's no way to prove whatever it is. No one else wants to talk about it. I'll keep investigating, but I feel like I'm poking at something far too dangerous. The Guardian. The name sounded like something out of an old legend, one of those stories told around the fireplace to scare kids. But there it was, mentioned in an official report. I closed the folder and leaned back in my chair, my mind racing. I vaguely remembered hearing whispers about this legend when I was a child. Something about an entity supposedly guarding the forest, an ancient spirit that didn't allow outsiders to violate its domain. But those stories always seemed silly to me, the kind of thing superstitious people came up with to explain the mysteries of rural life. Now, though I wasn't so sure, I grabbed the radio and called John, who was still in the kitchen. "John, did you know anything about disappearances in that forest in the 30s? I asked, trying to keep my voice neutral. He came back within seconds, still holding his coffee cup, a confused look on his face. "No idea. Why? Did you find something?" I showed him the reports. As he read them, I saw John's expression shift from curiosity to growing concern. "Is this serious? These disappearances? And this Guardian?" He stopped, frowning. "Sounds like one of those stories old folks tell to scare the young. But damn, the coincidences are hard to ignore." Coincidences, maybe, but now we've got 3 cases of young people vanishing in the same place in different decades. And now we have Emily. I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the situation. I'm not one to believe in these legends, but something's wrong, and it's tied to that forest. John was silent for a moment, sipping his coffee. He wasn't the type to be easily shaken either, but this situation was getting to both of us. "So what do we do now?" he finally asked. "We need to find out more about this legend, see if anyone in town knows anything." The name The Guardian wouldn't leave my mind. If it was just a story, why was it in the police reports? And if it wasn't, what were we really dealing with? I knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. The deeper I dug, the more it seemed like Northfield was hiding secrets everyone preferred to forget. And I felt that by continuing to investigate, I was opening a door that perhaps should never have been opened. But there was no turning back now. Emily was counting on us. I just hoped it wasn't too late. The next day, I went straight to Mrs. Abernathy's house, the local historian and one of the oldest and most respected people in Northfield. If anyone in town could help me understand what was going on in that forest, it was her. Though many saw her as just an old woman who hoarded dusty books and historical objects, I knew her knowledge of the region's legends and past was unmatched. Her house was perched on a small hill, surrounded by old trees and a wild, chaotic garden. As soon as I parked the car in the gravel driveway, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders, as if being out of the forest for a moment allowed me to breathe easier. Yet, a sense of anxiety still hung over me. The clues I found in the files suggested that what was happening to Emily wasn't the first time Northfield had faced this kind of event, and the reference to the Guardian seemed to be the thread tying all these disappearances together. I knocked on Mrs. Abernathy's door, and she opened it almost immediately, as if she had been expecting me. Her time-worn face greeted me with a serious expression. This wasn't the first time I'd visited her. She had always been someone I turned to when I needed context about the town's history, but something about the way she looked at me, as if she already knew why I was there, made me shudder. "Ah, Thomas, I figured you'd come," she said in a soft but weighty voice. "Come in, please." Her house was tight and stuffy, filled with overflowing bookshelves and heavy wooden furniture. A small fire burned in the corner, despite it still being fall, and the air was thick with the smell of herbal tea. I sat in a worn leather chair as she settled across from me, delicately holding a teacup in her hands. I heard about young Emily Watson's disappearance, she began, getting straight to the point. And I'm sure you're here for more than just a simple chat. I nodded slowly. The words were on the tip of my tongue, but I wasn't sure how to start. How do you talk about a legend that might be responsible for years of unexplained disappearances? The Guardian, I finally managed to say. What do you know about him? Mrs. Abernathy's eyes narrowed, and she took a deep breath, setting her teacup down on the table. Ah yes, the Guardian, she murmured with a slight bitterness in her voice. I haven't heard that name in many years, but of course it's one of the oldest legends here. Though, like all legends, most have forgotten or preferred to forget. She paused, as if she were rearranging her memories, perhaps deciding whether she should even tell me. Many believe that the Guardian is just a story to scare children, she continued, a way to keep young people out of the forest. But those who know the old stories understand there might be something more. Something that predates the settlers, something from much older times. I shifted in my chair, hanging on her every word. According to the legend, the Guardian is an entity that protects the forest. Not in the sense of preservation, but control. He doesn't allow anyone to invade his territory without a price. She paused, looking deeply into my eyes, as if trying to gauge my reaction. And sometimes that price is someone's life. I swallowed hard. What she was describing felt eerily familiar to the clues I found in the files and to Emily's disappearance. The forest, with its oppressive silence and the feeling of being watched, suddenly made more sense or less depending on how you looked at it. But why the young? I asked. Why does he target the younger ones? Mrs. Abernathy sighed, her gaze drifting into the shadows of the room. No one knows for sure. But, according to some versions of the legend, the Guardian has a connection to younger souls. He sees them as pure, untouched by the world, and therefore desires to trap them. There's a theory that says he uses these souls to maintain his power, or to sustain the forest in some way. He doesn't just capture the young. He traps them in a place beyond our world, a kind of parallel dimension, a space that coexists with ours but is out of reach from the reality we know. Like a sort of purgatory? I asked, feeling the weight of the words. Something like that. She responded, her tone somber. Those who are taken by the forest don't die in the traditional sense. They're held captive, lost among the trees, never finding their way back. The Guardian hides them, and no one who enters with bad intentions ever escapes. I absorbed this in silence, my heart beating faster as the pieces of the puzzle began to fit together. The clearing, the stones arranged in a circle, the suffocating silence. All of it could be connected to this other dimension that the legend mentioned. Maybe that's why the conventional searches failed. Emily wasn't just lost. She had been trapped in a place that didn't follow the normal rules of nature. And how does someone escape? I asked, my voice lower than I had intended. How can we bring Emily back? Mrs. Abernathy was silent for a long moment, the weight of the question clear on her face. When she finally answered, there was a deep sadness in her voice. There is no certain way to escape, Thomas. That's the curse of the legend. The few who managed to return were never the same. They can barely remember what happened. And those who disappear completely, well, they're never seen again. We can't just accept that, I said firmer now. She's out there. We have to try. She nodded slightly as if agreeing with me, but her gaze was one of warning. If you decide to go there, beyond the trees and beyond what is visible, you won't be walking in our world anymore. It will be his domain, and there he makes the rules. I have no choice, I responded, standing up. Emily is still alive. I feel that, and if there's any chance of bringing her back, I'll take the risk. Mrs. Abernathy sighed deeply and took an old, dusty book from the shelf beside her. She opened it and flipped through the pages until she found what she was looking for. It was an old illustration of indigenous origin, showing a hooded figure in the shadows of a dense forest, with eyes that glowed like those of a nocturnal predator. This is the Guardian, she said. And if you really want to face what's beyond, you'll need more than courage. You'll need to understand that once inside, nothing will be as it seems. He manipulates the environment, and what you see may not be real. I looked at the drawing, trying to memorize every detail. The sense of urgency was growing inside me. Time was running out, and I knew that if I didn't act quickly, Emily would be lost forever. Be careful, Thomas. Some legends are more real than we'd like to admit, she said as I left. I had no doubts. The Guardian was real, and now I was going to face him. Things started to unravel quickly in Northfield after Emily's disappearance. The news, which initially spread only as a rumor among neighbors, soon circulated like wildfire throughout the town. Within days, fear had gripped everyone. I saw it in the faces of the residents every time I walked down the street. The vacant look of people who no longer knew whom or what to trust. And once again, whispers about the Guardian began to resurface, like a ghost from the past that no one wanted to admit they believed in. Parents forbade their children from going out at night. The local school was almost empty, with children too scared to even think about leaving home. Some residents started reinforcing their windows and doors, as if an entity that could control the forest could be stopped by nails and wood. The town's lights, which used to shine only in the central areas, were now on in every neighborhood late into the night, a desperate gesture to ward off the darkness and the fear that came with it. I could feel the pressure mounting, both from the community and within myself. It wasn't just Emily who was missing. Now, it seemed like the town itself was slipping away, descending into a nightmare that none of us knew how to handle. The older residents recalled old cases, disappearances that had never been solved. The legend of the Guardian was back, being discussed in bars and markets, gaining strength each time it was repeated. The Watsons, devastated by their daughter's disappearance, stopped leaving their house. There wasn't a night I didn't hear Karen Watson crying softly when I passed by their home, my nightly patrol turning into a vigil, as if I could protect the town just by being present. And still, there was no progress. With each new day, I felt Emily slipping further away, dissolving into somewhere I couldn't reach. The piece of fabric found in the forest still sat on my desk, a constant reminder of my failure so far. As the town plunged into panic, John and I stayed focused on the investigation. We knew the forest held the answer, or at least part of it. However, the clearing and the stones arranged in a circle continued to defy us, like a riddle that resisted any attempt to be solved. We needed to go back there, but we couldn't risk retracing the same path without new resources. That's what led me to equip our team with more advanced gear. If there was something supernatural or strange happening in that forest, I wanted to be prepared. The next morning, we gathered what we had: powerful flashlights, infrared cameras, motion detectors, even high-frequency radios, anything that might give us an edge. I didn't know exactly what to expect, but I was determined to return to the clearing and uncover what was hiding behind that oppressive silence and the constant feeling of being watched. "You think this is going to work?" John asked as we tested the equipment in the back of the police car. He was trying to sound optimistic, but I could see the nervousness in his eyes. "I don't know, John, but we don't have another option. We need answers, and that forest has more than it seems," I replied, checking the batteries on the flashlights and adjusting the radio on my belt. The drive to the trailhead was quiet. The low, gray clouds seemed to press down on us even more, as if the sky itself was pushing us back. We parked the car in the same clearing where we had begun the previous searches, but this time we were armed not just with equipment, but with the knowledge that something was wrong, something far beyond a simple teenage girl lost in the forest. The feeling of being watched started before we even fully entered the woods. The wind was light, and the trees swayed gently, but the air was unnaturally still in a way that was impossible to ignore. It was as if something was hiding in the shadows, just waiting for our approach. We walked silently along the trail, alert to any movement. The equipment was ready. Every 30 meters, we set up a motion detector and took pictures with the infrared cameras, searching for any anomalies. But so far, nothing out of the ordinary. After about 15 minutes, we reached the clearing. As soon as my feet touched the ground there, I felt the air grow denser, heavy like lead. The stones were still there, unmoving, their surfaces covered in moss and moisture. But now, in the clear daylight, there was something I hadn't noticed before. Around the circle of stones, the grass seemed burned in some areas, and small mounds of raised earth appeared, as if someone or something had recently dug there. John was the first to kneel near one of the mounds. "Reed, are you seeing this?" He pulled something from the ground, a piece of fabric. The faded color was unmistakable. Another piece of Emily's clothing. My heart raced, and I moved closer, starting to dig alongside John. Every inch of earth we removed revealed more fragments of clothing. Not just Emily's, but from other young people, shirts, dresses, pieces of shoes, all worn down by time. Then, in the middle of the digging, John found something different. A metallic object gleamed under the weak sunlight. He carefully pulled it from the ground, and I could see it was an old medallion, silver tarnished by time. There were markings engraved on it, symbols that seemed familiar, but I couldn't immediately identify. "This is..." John started, but I already knew what he was thinking. The medallion was almost identical to the one described in the files from the 1930s. An artifact found near the body of Mary Fields, the girl who disappeared in 1934. My stomach churned. This couldn't be a coincidence. We were standing in front of a direct connection to the disappearances of the past. I held the medallion, feeling the cold metal in my hands. And at that moment, the wind in the clearing stopped. The silence that followed was so absolute that the sound of our hearts seemed to echo in the void around us. John stood up, looking around, his eyes wide. "Reed, I think we should get out of here now." I agreed with him. The air felt thicker, almost suffocating, as if the forest was closing in on us. But something stopped me from just leaving. There was more. Something was still hidden there, and I could feel it. "We can't leave yet," I muttered, trying to stay calm. "Not yet." That's when the radios on our belts crackled to life, cutting through the silence with a sharp static noise, as if something was trying to tune into our frequency. I looked at John, but he was already staring at the forest around us, terror spreading across his face. Something was with us, something that didn't want to be found, but was watching us, waiting. And I knew we were about to discover what really lurked in that forest. That night, after finding the medallion, I went home exhausted, but my mind was still fixated on the images of the forest. The worn pieces of clothing, the ancient medallion, the stones arranged in a circle. Everything seemed to conspire to pull me deeper into what I knew was unknown and dangerous territory. I tried to sleep, but sleep eluded me. For hours, I tossed and turned in bed, listening to the sound of rain tapping against the window. My body was heavy, but my mind wouldn't stop working, trying to connect the dots. The disappearances in the 1930s, the clothes found in the clearing, the legend of the Guardian. Everything pointed to something beyond simple reality in that forest. Something old, forgotten, but still active. When I finally drifted off, the dreams came like an attack. At first, I thought I was still awake. I was standing in the middle of the forest, alone. The trees loomed like long, twisted shadows around me, and the silence was absolute. The same silence I had felt during the search. I walked along the trail, but my steps made no sound, and the air felt thick, almost sticky, as if every breath took effort. Suddenly, something caught my attention. There was a figure ahead, partially hidden by the shadows of the trees. My heart raced, and I felt the same chill down my spine that I had felt during the day. The figure looked like a girl, with long hair falling over her shoulders. Her silhouette was vague, almost ghostly, but recognizable. "Emily! Emily?" I called out, my voice echoing through the emptiness around me. She didn't answer. She just stood there, watching me. I started walking toward her, my steps hesitant. With each step I took, I felt the forest around me changing. The trees bent, as if they were watching too. When I got closer to the figure, I saw something disturbing. It wasn't Emily's eyes staring back at me. They were two dark, empty voids, expressionless. Her mouth opened slightly, and an almost inaudible whisper escaped her lips. "Help me!" In that instant, everything changed. Her figure vanished like smoke in the wind, and the trees began to close in around me, their twisted branches reaching for me. The air turned icy, and I felt panic rising inside me. I turned, trying to run back, but the path I knew was gone. I was trapped in the middle of the forest, surrounded by shadows that whispered in low, unintelligible voices, but full of a promise of death. I woke up gasping, covered in sweat, the sound of the whisper still echoing in my mind. I got out of bed and washed my face in the bathroom, trying to shake off that suffocating feeling. But the dream had felt so real that it was hard to separate it from reality. The image of Emily's empty eyes wouldn't leave me. In the days that followed, the nightmares continued, always dragging me back to the forest. In each dream, Emily's figure appeared, always distant, always watching me with that hollow gaze. And every time I tried to reach her, the forest around me transformed into something monstrous, distorted, as if the very environment were alive and aware. During the subsequent searches, I tried to focus on the facts, but the line between reality and dream began to blur. The silence of the forest, the weight of the air, the feeling of being watched. All of it seemed to intensify, and I no longer knew if my mind was playing tricks on me or if there was truly something supernatural lurking. On the third night after the discovery in the clearing, we returned to the forest, this time more prepared, or so we thought. The beams from our flashlights lit the trail unevenly, casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to dance around us. John was quiet beside me, maybe feeling the same discomfort I did, but not voicing it. That's when I heard the whispers. At first, I thought it was just the sound of the wind passing through the trees, but soon I realized there was a cadence to it, a kind of rhythm in the unintelligible words. I stopped walking, trying to pinpoint where the sound was coming from. "Did you hear that?" I asked John, feeling my heart beat faster. "What?" He looked around, confused, but his eyes revealed that he too felt something strange. The whispers continued, louder now, as if they were all around us, but with no clear source. I couldn't understand what they were saying, but the words carried a sense of dread I had never experienced before. It was as if the very air was saturated with the presence of something evil. "Someone's here," I muttered, more to myself than to John. Suddenly, something moved in the shadows ahead, at the edge of the flashlight's beam. A silhouette, tall and slender, like a hooded figure, but blurred, as if it were out of focus. My body froze. I knew that wasn't human, but something in me wanted to believe it was just my mind playing tricks on me. John pointed the flashlight toward the figure, but when the light hit it, it disappeared. There were no footsteps, no crunching leaves, just emptiness. "What was that, Reed?" John asked, his voice tense. I didn't know. The line between real and unreal was dissolving, and I was starting to doubt my own senses. But one thing was clear. The forest was alive with something we didn't understand. And the more we investigated, the deeper we fell into its grasp. As we returned to town that night, with our flashlights off and the weight of the days of fruitless searching on our shoulders, I knew we were approaching a breaking point. The Guardian, if he was real, was watching us, manipulating, and slowly he was pulling us into his game, a game we weren't prepared to win. But there was one thing I couldn't get out of my head. Emily was still out there, somewhere between the real and the supernatural, waiting, and I wasn't going to give up on her, even if it meant facing the worst that forest had to offer. Deep down, I knew the next step would be the most dangerous of all. After the last search in the forest, I knew I needed more than clues and fragments of legends. Reality was fracturing around me, and the closer I got to whatever was trapped in that forest, the heavier the supernatural weight became. Deep down, I didn't want to believe, but it was impossible to ignore what I had seen. The whispers, the spectral figures, and the constant feeling of being watched. Emily was still out there somehow, but conventional search methods were failing. We needed another approach. That's why I went back to Mrs. Abernathy's house. As soon as I entered her stuffy, book-filled living room, I felt the gravity of the situation. She was sitting in the same armchair where I had left her the last time, but her face looked even paler, her eyes more tired, as if she too was being consumed by the very legend. "I knew you'd return," she said, without lifting her eyes from an old book resting on her lap. "We need more, Mrs. Abernathy," I said, sitting across from her. This guardian, whatever he is, isn't going to let Emily go. And we're not going to find her just by walking through the forest. Something bigger is happening. Something beyond what we can handle with equipment and traditional searches. She closed the book carefully, as if even mentioning the guardian was risky. The sound of the book closing echoed through the room, and she looked up at me with an expression that didn't hide her concern. "Thomas, you're dealing with forces that don't belong to our world. I warned you about this," she said, her eyes gleaming in the dim light of the fireplace. "But there is something that can be done. Something that, according to the oldest legends, might appease the guardian." I leaned forward, the tension building inside me. "Tell me anything. I have to try. I can't give up on Emily." She hesitated for a moment, as if reluctant to drag me deeper into this. But then, taking a deep breath, she began to speak. "There's a ritual," she said, her words slow and measured. "An ancient ritual, forgotten by most, even by the oldest in Northfield. It dates back to before the settlers. The natives who lived in these lands spoke of an entity that guarded the forest, and they learned, over centuries, how to appease this force. The ritual was never properly documented, but the fragments that remain suggest that it involves a symbolic sacrifice, an offering to the guardian." I felt a chill run up my spine. Symbolic sacrifice? I wasn't religious, and my natural inclination was toward skepticism, but I had seen too much to dismiss any possibility now. "What exactly does the ritual involve?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "According to what I found in some old texts, the ritual must be performed in the clearing itself," she continued, picking up the book again and opening it to a specific page. "The stones arranged in a circle are not there by chance. They're part of a veil between our world and his, the guardian. You must prepare an offering, something personal, something that symbolizes loss and the search. Once the ritual begins, he will manifest in some way, and maybe allow the person he's taken to be freed." With every word she spoke, the air in the room felt heavier. The skepticism I had always carried as a cop, a shield against the inexplicable, began to crack. "And if it doesn't work?" I asked, my voice quieter. Mrs. Abernathy closed the book, setting it aside gently. "If it doesn't work, you may never return from the forest, Thomas. The guardian does not handle failure kindly." I knew the decision before me was the hardest I had ever faced. Emily's life was on the line, but what would it cost me? I was willing to risk everything for a chance to save her, but the price would be steep. Something told me that once involved with the guardian, there was no going back to normalcy. But hesitation wasn't an option. Emily was out there and time was running out. "I'll do the ritual," I finally said, my voice filled with a determination I hadn't known I possessed. Mrs. Abernathy handed me an amulet, an old piece similar to the medallion we had found in the clearing, but much more detailed. The symbols carved into it glowed in the light of the fireplace, and she explained that it would be part of the offering. A symbol of my journey, of my search for Emily. As I left her house that night, I felt the weight of the decision crushing me. I was stepping into dangerous territory, but I knew it was the only chance to save Emily, and maybe to save myself. 2 days later, we were ready to return to the clearing. This time, we only brought the essentials, John, me, and 2 other trusted officers, Carl and Stephen. The plan was simple, but what we were about to face was anything but. We had the amulet, the knowledge of the ritual, and the courage of those with no other choice. We didn't know what to expect, but we all knew this would be the final search. There was no room for hesitation anymore. The morning was shrouded in a thick fog as we left the station. Northfield seemed almost deserted. People locked themselves in their homes, as if they knew something terrible was about to happen in that forest. And maybe they did. The rumors about the guardian continued to spread through the town, increasingly distorted and filled with fear. But no one spoke to us as we headed toward the trail. As soon as we entered the forest, silence took over everything. I was used to that oppressive silence by now, but this time it was different. It felt heavier, denser, as if the forest itself was waiting for us. We walked in single file, not speaking, each of us lost in our own thoughts. John was right behind me, the other two following in silence, but I felt the tension between us like an electric current. We reached the clearing and prepared ourselves. The stones, the same ones I had seen so many times, seemed more imposing, more threatening. They were covered in moss, but now I could see the symbols carved into them, something I hadn't noticed before. Ancient markings that seemed to have been etched by long-forgotten hands. "All right, let's make this quick," John said, his voice tense. We began to set up the circle according to Mrs. Abernathy's instructions. The amulet was placed in the center, along with other items that, according to her, symbolized the journey. A piece of Emily's fabric, the old medallion we found, and even a broken watch I had kept for years, a reminder of lost time. Each piece had a personal meaning, and all of them were part of the offering. As the ritual began, a strange wind started to blow through the clearing, swirling around us, as if the forest itself was stirring. The air grew colder, and the silence was broken by distant whispers, the same ones I had heard in my nightmares. And then, as we completed the ritual, something happened. In the center of the circle, the ground began to tremble. It was as if the earth was crumbling, creating a crack. The clearing was bathed in a faint, bluish light, seeming to emanate from within the ground. The earth slowly opened, revealing a hidden door, an old bunker, made of concrete and metal, covered by layers of soil and vegetation. But there was something wrong with that place. The door wasn't just an entrance to the bunker. The atmosphere around it was dense, filled with a supernatural energy. This wasn't just a shelter. It was a portal to another dimension. "What the hell is that?" Carl murmured, his voice trembling. I knew what it was. I knew that was the entrance to the Guardian's domain. A place where the rules of our world didn't apply. A place from which few, if any, returned. "We have to go in," I said, feeling the weight of the decision crush me. John's face was filled with pure fear, but he nodded. There was no choice. Emily was on the other side, and I knew that if we hesitated, we would never have another chance. We walked toward the door. The air around us seemed to vibrate, as if we were about to cross an invisible barrier. The sound of whispers grew louder, and everyone's eyes were fixed on the darkness beyond the door. This was the point of no return. When we crossed the door to the bunker, the world around us changed in an abrupt and disturbing way. The feeling of crossing a portal was like plunging into a deep, icy pit where time and space warped around us. The air felt thicker, almost suffocating, and the darkness was tangible, wrapping around us in layers. There were no more distant whispers from the forest. Instead, we heard a low hum, as if we were in the heart of something ancient and evil. John was next to me, his flashlight trembling in his hand as he illuminated what seemed to be a long, narrow corridor, made of smooth, damp stone with a dark hue. The walls appeared to move, as if the very structure of the place was alive. This wasn't just a bunker, it was a prison, a place between the real and the unreal. "Reed, where are we?" John whispered, his voice shaking. "I don't know, but whatever this is, we're not in our reality anymore," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady, even though fear was beginning to gnaw at me from within. As we walked deeper into the corridor, the flashlights flickered and trembled. Spectral figures began to appear in the shadows. At first, they were just vague shapes, poorly formed, as if they were memories of people who had once been there. But as we moved forward, these figures became clearer. And then I realized they were the missing. "My God!" John murmured, pointing to a figure on our right. It was a young girl, pale and translucent, with disheveled hair and empty eyes. She stood there, as if trapped in an endless loop, moving her lips silently. I moved closer, trying to hear what she was saying, but her words made no sense, mixed with the constant hum of that dimension. "They're trapped here. All of them," I said, horror growing in my chest. As we ventured deeper, the voices of the missing echoed around us, growing louder, more desperate. They were whispers filled with pain, regret, and something darker, a despair that spanned time and space. The figures floated around us, watching us with empty, lifeless eyes. I realized many of those faces were familiar, The victims of the disappearances from the 1930s were their pale reflections of who they once were. We passed through a stone door that opened with a groan, and there, in the center of that distorted dimension, we saw Emily. She was suspended in the air, as if held by invisible threads. Her body looked fragile, pale, but she was alive. Her eyes were closed, and her face was serene, a stark contrast to the chaos around us. But something was holding her there, a supernatural force we couldn't see, but that was everywhere. "Emily!" I called, my voice echoing through the space. She didn't react. It was as if she were in a deep trance, lost between this world and ours. Suddenly, a chill ran down my spine, and the shadows around us began to move faster. The Guardian was near. I knew that if we didn't act soon, we would lose the chance to bring her back. "We need to get her out of here, Reed. Now," John said, his voice a mix of fear and urgency. I took a step toward Emily, but before I could reach her, the air around us shifted. The temperature dropped sharply, and an oppressive presence began to form in front of us. The Guardian. He didn't have a defined form, but he was an imposing, shadowy figure, with a cloak of darkness that seemed to merge with the environment. His eyes glowed like burning slits in the midst of the blackness, watching us with an ancient, malevolent intelligence. The Guardian didn't speak in words. His presence was a voice in my mind, a pressure that spread through my body as if it were draining the very energy from my soul. I could feel his power, an overwhelming force, and I understood in that moment that this was his domain. He controlled everything around us, and we were completely at his mercy. "She cannot leave without paying the price." The Guardian's voice echoed inside me, deep and cutting. "You wish to free her, but the price is high. Her freedom requires a trade." I already knew the sacrifice was coming, but in that moment, I understood what he truly wanted. The Guardian wasn't interested in simple objects or symbols. He demanded something deeper, a part of me. I looked at Emily, suspended and helpless, then at John, who was pale and trembling. The Guardian wanted a trade of lives, of souls. I knew that if I didn't agree to the deal, Emily would be trapped forever in that limbo, and maybe I would too. "What do you want from me?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. The shadowy figure moved closer, and I felt a crushing pressure in my chest. "Your soul," the Guardian whispered. "You must give something of equal value, something that can never be recovered." His words swirled in my mind. My soul? My life? He wanted me to trade my fate for Emily's. I knew that if I accepted, I would never be the same again. The Guardian wouldn't just release Emily. He would leave a mark on my existence, forever trapping a part of me in that dimension with him. John, realizing what was happening, took a step forward. "Reed, no, you can't do this." He knew what I was about to do. He knew that if I offered the sacrifice, the consequences would be irreversible. But I couldn't hesitate. Emily was there, and she didn't deserve to be trapped in that nightmare. I knew that if I had to make a choice, I would make it again. "I accept," I said, my voice low but firm. "Take what you need, but free Emily." The Guardian moved closer, and I felt a deep pain in my chest, as if something was being ripped out of me. The sensation of loss was immediate, overwhelming. A part of me, something essential, was taken by the Guardian. It wasn't just my soul. It was something more intangible, something that shaped who I was. The shadowy figure retreated, and Emily's body began to slowly descend to the ground. The air around us seemed to relax, but I knew that something inside me was broken, something that could never be fixed. I had paid the price, and now it would be my burden for the rest of my life. John ran to Emily, helping her up. She opened her eyes slowly, confused but alive. "Reed, you did it," John said, his voice filled with relief. But I knew that even though we had saved Emily, I had lost something much greater. I felt the Guardian's cold touch on my soul, an invisible mark I would carry forever. I looked one last time at the shadows of the distorted dimension, knowing that, in some way, I was still tied to that place. We returned to Northfield, and the town looked the same, but I knew something had changed. The Guardian was satisfied, for now, but a part of me remained in that dimension, and from that moment on, I knew I would never be the same again. Emily was saved, but me? I was lost. The guardian is always watching.